is where I look at it. What am I trying to accomplish? What's my long-term strategy? Was my long-term strategy finish life early and then check out? What like that's what you find so interesting is once you have those resources, now you can make a bigger impact. Now now you have what I would call a good business model.
This is the Money Seed Podcast, where we discuss all things investing, plain and simple, the way it should be. Please remember, this show is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not intended to be investment advice. Welcome back to the Money Seed Podcast. Today, my guest is Shelley. Aaron is an author, an entrepreneur, an executive, and he's here today to tell us about how to run your family like a business. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Gabe. I'm really excited to be here.
So Aaron, why don't we start with your background? How did you get to become an author, entrepreneur, and executive?
It was an accident. So I started in mechanical engineering, did an undergrad there, and then I got frustrated as an engineer working at a company. And I found that business people kind of controlled, great engineers and bad business people make for a failed business. So I had some frustration when I was working on some R&D. Then I got an MBA. And then my wife and I actually started an Irish dance business. She was into that. So I did that right after the MBA instead of going to a large firm, which is a little strange. But we had read Rich Dad, Poor Dad and kind of wanted the asset, it was good. It's been really good in the long term. But then I worked at a company like Ancestry.com. They're big. Then worked for there. They did an IPO. I was small, just young in my career, but went through that process of implementing Oracle, all that stuff. Then I went to a startup in genealogy space in about 3 years and $11 million. We failed. So then I kind of had this opportunity where my wife was like, well, what do we need to do? Because we'd set ourselves up. Turns out my mom happened to know a guy who was writing a book on entrepreneurship and family. So I started to do the research there. And I was like, hey, here's a better model for your book. And so I put together this model, wrote about 50 pages. Here's how you do it. Here you go. And he said, no, that's your book. So I was like, I guess I didn't really want to do that. So ended up getting it mostly done in about 2018, and then had an opportunity to be and kind of go from a company at 20 people, took it to about 180 in the last 4 years. So then we took about 54 million of private equity, stayed there for a year, and then had the opportunity to step back. So now I'm kind of like, okay, what am I going to do with my time, with my energy, now that I have a little more stability? And so I'm just looking at what are the big problems. And I think the family is one of the big problems that we're having right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I believe that the title of the book is called The Family Flywheel. Tell us exactly what can people learn from the book?
So the flywheel, if you're familiar with the book, Good to Great, there's this concept where businesses, if you do it well, you get money, then you spend it well, you invest it well, then you get more. This idea of compounding interest is a common flywheel in the financial space. But if you kind of expand it out, you see that it's not just financial assets that people need to get. It's also social assets. Like if you're a company, you need to build your brand, your marketing and sales teams. And then you also need to build human resources, better skill sets, more time, better health. Those three resources are really what companies use in their business model. And if you have a good business model, you get more resources of any of those three types. Then you run them through the business model again, and you have this flywheel that's not just monetary. It's actually being compounded with these other resource types as well.
And Aaron, maybe let's start off with a typical family. The problem I have with the whole family management is that just when you think you got everything figured out, the family dynamic changes, right? You have a child, you have a second child. Now the child needs to go to a different school. Someone gets laid off and you got to go move somewhere to get a new job. I guess, what are some of the tips you have on how to manage the complexity and the changing complexity of a family?
Well, to me, the biggest thing is having a strategy, right? You got to have a strategy. That's the most important part of a business model is what is your strategy? If you're an individual and you're not married, then that's just what's your strategy in life currently. But once you get married, you need to know, well, what's our strategy as a couple? Is the thing like we're trying to maximize my husband's job while the wife takes care of the kids, or are we trying to maximize both of our careers and have kids later? Like there's all these strategies that if you're on the same page where we're investing, like my husband's going to become a doctor or my wife's going to become a doctor, And so we're investing in that, and then we're going to try to take advantage of that later in life. So if you're looking at if you're looking at an overall strategy, just like in any any financial investing, are you going to go in real estate? Are you going to go in business? Are you going to go, hard metals? What's your strategy for your family? And if you don't have that figured out, then it's really hard to develop the structure and culture to support that.
Aaron, what are some of your tips or personal experiences? How can a couple get aligned, right? Because everyone has ideas. And if a couple is lucky enough, then they're going to communicate about those ideas, because quite often even the communication doesn't happen, right? And you're trying to guess what the other person's thinking. But even if they're good at communication and they say, look, these are my dreams, this is what I want to do, etc. How can those two individuals get aligned on things like a strategy, a budget, a career plan, etc.?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing, if we look in business, how do we do that? Well, we have meetings and we start to look, what is our future? Why are we even in this business together? Right? If you and I started a business together, the first question would be, are you going to do the engineering and I'm going to do the marketing, or vice versa? Like, why did we want this business together? Was it just because you're like, well, he's cool, I'm going to go into business? And I'm like, well, I don't even know what roles. So a lot of it's like, why did you get married? And then what roles are you trying to accomplish? What strategy did you have? Most people don't just start in life and they're like, well, you don't get married like, I don't know what I want to do with my life. Cool, let's get married. It's more like, I'm going this direction. Here's what I want to do. And then you'll have the other person go, that sounds exciting, I want to do that too. So I think a lot of it in the business world, this is where I say you're implementing, in the subtitle of the book is The Secret Business Principles Successful Families Use, because you're using the same business principles, right? Like, are you having annual meetings with your spouse and like, what are we trying to do? Are we getting closer? Are we getting further away? Are you having quarterly meetings? Because, everyone hates meetings. However, when you don't have them, then all of a sudden you start to see alignment issues. Right now, it's one person's working over here, another person's working on something totally different, and then you start to see those issues. So a lot of it's just the structure of a business is we have annual meetings, we have quarterly meetings, we have weekly meetings just that are pretty light, but it just keeps us together. And so to me, it's a lot of just the basic structure that a lot of people don't have, where it's, hey, the big annual, like what are our long-term goals, but then breaking it up and then staying on top of it together.
And that's exactly it. I agree 100% with the idea that, whether you call it meetings from a business perspective or just communication from a human perspective, but you absolutely have to communicate regularly, on all things. How many kids we want, when are the kids coming? When is it a good time? Do we buy a house? Do we keep renting an apartment? Do I go back to school? Do I go back to school part-time while I keep working? All these things you got to talk about and you got to sort it all out.
I mean, it's the whole risk assessment, right? You're like, well, what are we trying to do? I've heard people when they go to college and they're like, I should buy a house. Like my daughter, she's married. She was like, I'm going to buy a house. I'm like, you really have a year or two left. That's not a good strategy financially, because you're going to have to pay your closing costs and then you're going to have to sell it. And if things don't go up, you might be underwater. Then you have all these other issues that aren't really key to your strategy. But so many people get caught up in I'm trying to just make money. So then they're making poor life choices versus making the right life choice.
Do you have any good recommendations for somebody in their 20s? Let's say someone is in their mid-20s, they just finished college, maybe they got their first job or their first they're just on the road to establishing their career. What are some of the pitfalls people should avoid? And what are some of the tips you have for them?
There's an interesting concept as I've thought through this. I got married when I was 21, barely, almost 22. And so if you looked at it, I really had no resources to speak of. I didn't have my degree yet. I spent my last $2,000 on a wedding ring, right? I didn't have a house. It was this very early, it was like a startup. My wife was kind of the same way. I think she had a car. And so coming together when you have very little resources is pretty easy, right? Because it's like, okay, it's a 50-50 relationship. Let's go make this company, let's go make this family great. What I've seen is a lot of people who wait until their career is really well established. They get into their 30s and then they're like, okay, now I'm ready. And you're like, yeah, now you might have a house and you have all these other things, a lot of money in the bank, you have a career, you bring all these assets, and then you start to go with another person. If they're in that same mode, you're really doing a merger, right? You're not doing a startup anymore. You're doing a merger. And as anyone who's worked at bigger companies who have merged with other companies, they're not very productive all the time because you have so much overlap, and then you have to sell things, you have to figure all that out. You had your processes, who gets rid of those processes? So I think a lot of it is, a lot of people will wait till they're kind of older, and it ends up being actually more complicated for many people to get married at that point, because you have these other pieces. So I think it's good to look at it from the early point of, what are you trying to accomplish? Because you don't need to have a massive salary to get married. You don't need to have a lot of those things. Just like a startup, you get in there, you're like, oh, how much money we got in the bank? $50,000. Okay, there's two of us. This doesn't even pay for one of us for a long term, but we're going to make it work. And what you find is then you actually struggle together, and then you actually make it work. And that's a little bit, so there's a little bit of, I think, people waiting too long. I had a friend who he was 40 and he could retire. And he was like, but he wasn't married, had no kids. And he's like, well, but I have all this money. I don't want to risk that on some woman. What happens if she takes it? Like, ooh, right. So I think a little bit's that. Does that make sense? I mean, there's that piece.
It makes sense, yeah, because what I'm hearing is it's very difficult, and I get it. It's very difficult to optimize, because you're trying to optimize 3 or 4 competing things, right? On the one hand, you're trying to maximize your career potential and your earnings potential. At the same time, you want to have that ideal family, in the house with the picket fence and the dog in the backyard, and then you still want to have some time and money left for yourself. Maybe you want to retire early, and those things are all competing, right? And there's this myth that if I just, for example, let's talk about having the first child, right? If someone says, you know what, now is not the right time. Maybe it'll be the right time a few years from now when we have that house, when I have that amazing job, when I'm more established in my professional career, whatever. But the reality is that perfect time never comes, right? Because life is always complicated. So that's why there's this really scary statistic that I read somewhere that apparently this is kind of true now in most developed nations, right? Where a woman who is a college graduate who doesn't have a child by the time she's 30, there's a 50% chance she will never have one, right? It's because they're professional women, they're ambitious, and they just, oh, maybe I'll have a child at 35. And then when they're 35, oh, maybe I'll wait till I'm 39. Mm-hmm. And you know what? Things never align perfectly. You always have to have some kind of a trade-off to make things work.
Well, and this goes back to the engineering background, right? As an engineer, you're always making trade-offs, right? It's like, well, I could make it stronger, but then it becomes heavier. And if I'm trying to make a jet, okay, I'm always trying to be just on the edge. So I think it's really a good insight when you look at it and say, there's never going to be a right time. But it's interesting. I've heard some data, like to the point of a lot of men spend, I think it's in the tens of thousands of dollars every year that they're not married, trying to get married, going to clubs, wasting time, going to party, all these type of things. And it's like, if you start, I think when you add it up, I think it was around 25,000 is the number that I heard put on it per year, just because you're buying cars, you're trying to status it up, right? And you look at that and then they're like, well, where did that money go? You're just trying to get a girl, but not actually get married in a lot of cases. And so I think of some of it's like, what are you trying to do now? And I've seen it with a lot of men. There's a book, The Female Brain and the Male Brain, but specifically on the male side, once you get married and have a child, your brain actually changes, right? And so you end up in this state where if you're a guy and you get married, then you start to specialize, and men generally don't take care of themselves very well. Right? We don't care about our health very well, our food very well. So essentially you start to specialize. And often, in my case, my wife's like, I love to take care of the family's health. So she makes good meals. I don't have to worry about that. So when you start to get into it, you start to specialize and you become more efficient. And then you're like, well, now I don't have to worry about food, shopping, all these activities. I don't have to worry about sex because I'm already married. So then I can just focus on my job. And that's the thing that a lot of times, people will go like, married men make more money on average than single men. And you go, why would that be? Well, because it's not just a married man. It's a married man with usually and often a wife behind him or helping him be more successful. Right. And so there's these dynamics. And I'm not saying you have to have a wife who doesn't work. My wife has run a dance studio for the last 25 years, but it was always the dance studio was the resource that was providing some stability, and she was doing that, but I was also helping on that. And then I was taking bigger risks in my career. Some of them, I at a startup didn't work out. And then in this last one, it worked out really well. So it's kind of like you want to diversify your risk profile because, I got laid off at a company or that startup went down and I'm like, well, it doesn't hurt me. I don't have to change where I live because I have the stability. Whereas if you're like, oh, we're just all in on the one career and we don't have any assets underlying or underneath to support it, then you get in this case of, oh, I just got laid off. Now I got to go get a different job. I got to sell my house, right? So then I had selling at the wrong time. I'm pulling kids out. So I think you lose some stability when you're not investing for stability. You're just investing for financial return.
Absolutely. And I want to get back to that example you gave about how some single men spend, I think the figure you mentioned was 25,000, which is a really big amount. And that's actually dangerous in more ways than one, because if you get sucked into this lifestyle where you're driving a car you can't afford and you're wearing sneakers you can't afford and you have these like fancy suits you can't afford, and if that's the lifestyle you're selling your partner on, it's going to be very difficult later on to tell that same partner, hey, listen, we're going to have to tighten the belts here and we're going to have to cut our budget and, no more fancy cars, no more fancy vacations because we're saving money. That's going to be tough. And so,
yeah, exactly. Your strategy would have been unaligned, right? She was like, here's the lifestyle. I'm marrying this lifestyle. And then you're like, either I got to double my income right now to maintain this for a family or we're screwed.
Yeah. And even if you can double your income, you're not doubling your income to retire early or to buy that fancy house. You're doubling your income to pay like 2 car payments or something that's really not a very wise way to spend your money anyway.
Well, yeah, that's the place where I think is if you get aligned on those longer term goals and you're also in your short term, like when I was 21, I was like, I just want to get married now. It's that time. Like I'm ready to move on with that to this next portion of my life. And there was definitely, I started as an engineer in school and then I got an MBA, switched that direction. And my wife was like, okay, that works. And we figured out, I think I left college with almost zero debt. I think I had a loan out, but I had all the money in the bank to cover it because we had made these decisions on how to go about it. And that's where I think, I was working, my wife worked, but we were trying to minimize our debt. And the thing that I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I absolutely loved the book because it described money. That was the first time I understood how money worked, right? I was like, I know how to save. How do I invest? And so I followed his path. The problem I found was in 2007, when I invested in real estate, then in 2008, when I took a $250,000 hit and I put my home in jeopardy, my other business in jeopardy, and I also pushed my mental health. I was like, that may have been a good quote unquote decision if I was just trying to maximize financial returns, but I was not taking into account my mental health, which I call a human resource, right? So I was just trying to maximize that instead of my human resources. Well, for me and my wife, after we had that happen, we said, we got to pay off this debt now. So in the next 6 years, we paid off 6 or 7 years, $350,000 in debt. We're like, I want zero debt. So I have a lower risk profile because I want to take these other risks in my career, right? And that was the piece that I never thought about was the consequence of my investing strategy. If you talk to any investment person, they will say, don't pay off your house. It's a stupid thing. Go in the stock market. You're getting such a great rate, right? This I've heard over and over again, but they're not taking into account your mental health. They're not taking into account the distraction that it feels every time you see some of these liabilities and those things come and due. Once I got all my debt paid off, I was just like, no, I don't have to think about it. It's like off of my mental task list, period. And it felt so freeing in some ways. So I think that's where I think there's this other piece, these other resources we have to account for when we're investing. Otherwise, I was in a very bad mental space when that happened. I was a young dad, had a house that I was paying a mortgage on, had 4 kids. And then that happened. Mentally, I may not have made it if I didn't have good support in the terms of my family close by.
I think financial struggles and financial difficulty is it's either the number 1 or the number 2 reason why people get divorced. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you were able to navigate that can you take us through maybe were you and your spouse fully aware of what could go wrong when you started investing in real estate in 2007? And when it did go wrong, can you offer some tips? How did those conversations go? And how were you guys able to get on the same page and get past it?
Well, yeah. So to start out, my wife and I both played the cash flow game. So we both understood the lingo of investing, which I think is super important. And then every time we were talking about stuff, is this an investment? Is it a doodad? Right? We had all of the investment lingo correct. So we started with the common language, which I think is important. And there were points when my wife's like, why don't you just take care of this? Why do you have to ask me? And I'm like, because I don't want to be the only one on the hook, even though I feel like I'm on the hook for the financial burden of the family. I didn't want to be making all these decisions alone without her knowing, right? So that was a good starting point. But then when this happened, I mean, you look at it and I'm like, what's the worst that could happen? It goes down $20,000, $30,000. I mean, we were trying to make 40,000, right? It was like a spec home where you turn it and you're just like, what can go wrong? And then it was like, everything hit. The builder didn't work out. The builder got taken into court. Then the bank starts to do it. Then you end up with legal fees. And you went through this. And I was just like, you don't realize everything can go wrong until everything does go wrong. And it's really hard, I think, for us when we're young in our investment careers to understand the mental stress and also the extent to which everything can go wrong. And I will say, I should have looked at my family and been like, oh, my father-in-law invests in real estate. My brother-in-law invests in real estate. I should go talk to both of them first, get their advice, make sure that I'm doing something smart, and then do it. But I was like, no, I'm an individual. This is my family. And I didn't take advantage of my social resources. But anyway, so yeah, when the crap started to hit the fan, I was like, oh, what does this mean? How does this go through? Then you get involved with lawyers. And then I was like, I was like, well, what's my exposure? And then they're like, well, here's your full exposures. And by the way, we think you did some illegal stuff. We think the bank did, all of a sudden everyone, when you start to litigate, the lawyers just go crazy and throw everything at the wall. And so then my wife and I were in this crazy space of, we just got to keep going. But what do we do? And how much, now we have this extra loan. We have no house. We have nothing to sell. The market's gone down a ton. What do we do? And I was in this horrible spot, at which point my dad came over and was talking me through it. And a little bit like, I don't know that I got it, but I think what he was saying was, I got your back. You're not going to go homeless. Your kids aren't going to be at risk. There was this safety net to speak of. And like I say, I was in a bad mental space. And then my wife's like, we'll get through this, and that's the other benefit, in my opinion, of being married. It's emotional diversification, right? You may be high, they're low. I was super low and she was higher. She's like, we'll get through it. And to her credit, it didn't take us that long once we focused on it and we're like, screw this. We're not doing anything else until we get out of debt. So I think the journey is a lot around, and I had a similar experience. I got audited by the IRS a few years ago, and my brain was just in this, everything can go wrong. Like, oh, I could be in prison. Oh, that would be bad. And then, they could lose my house. And turns out, talked to an accountant. My accountant got everything taken care of. Nothing big. But it's just this, like, the mental stress of investing is often so much more, especially when things go wrong. And I think that's when people, it's the same with the stock market. You start watching your investments go down by 5 or 10% in a month. And then you're like, I got to get out. Okay, you're getting out. Now you're going to sell low. So it's the whole, like, trying to manage your emotions. And if you're an individual, even if you're married, I mean, for me, it was super hard to manage the emotions. And it's interesting because the 3 hells in my life, all of them were difficult monetarily, but the hardest piece, I actually didn't need any monetary support from anyone. All I needed was the mental support through those experiences, which was kind of weird to me because I was more concerned about the financial, and yet it wasn't the thing I needed the most.
Yeah, about the stock market and the whole emotional roller coaster thing. Both you and I are engineers, and I think that's one way that engineers struggle in the stock market is, as engineers, like, we are told just analyze everything until you're like 99% sure it's going to work, right? Until your factor of safety is like 3.0 or greater. And the stock market doesn't work that way, right? Like, no matter how much you analyze a stock, you're never going to be more than like 60% or 70% right, even in the sort of the most amazing outcomes. And so, the whole managing emotions, that takes time. That's not something that can be taught. That's something you just have to learn through experience. And I read somewhere that between 80 and 90% of retail traders on the stock market lose money. And you'd figure that if you're just like throwing darts at a dartboard, just randomly picking stocks, you should be right about half the time, give or take. And yet, no, most people lose money. And it's not because they picked the wrong stocks. It's because they can't manage their emotions. And almost every single successful investor out there says they became successful when they learned how to manage their emotions. So that's a huge part of it. And that's true with any investment. And I think that's one thing that I wish the YouTube channels would also spend time on, is what happens when things go wrong, right? Because you mentioned how in 2007, you reached out to your network and you had some family members who invested in real estate, et cetera. Whereas today, a lot of people just go on YouTube. For example, I'm a huge fan of like Bigger Pockets on YouTube. I'm a real estate investor as well. There's the real estate guys on YouTube, and they are full of a lot of amazing advice. But there's this survivor bias in there where like the only people they interview are people who've made like $1 million on real estate, right? They usually tend not to interview those people who lose a ton of money on real estate and are really struggling with it. So I'm really glad that you're able to work through that, and it sounds like you learned from it and you moved on, and you're a stronger, better person today as a result.
Yeah, that's one of those things where if you were to look at it, again, from the engineering perspective, don't pay off your debt. Like that's the thing that everyone will tell you. But from the emotional, if you look at us as humans, assuming you're a human like the rest of us, you're going to have problems with that emotional roller coaster that happens. And so I think that's where I kind of expand in my model. It's like you have to include your health, your physical health, your mental health into your business model for how you're investing, right? I mean, there's the whole, because if you look at the investment strategy, do you invest in real estate now, or do you invest in education and then become smarter, then you invest in real estate? This is kind of, how do you think about it, and how do you go about doing it in my opinion, the most optimal way? But you're like, how much of your net worth should you put at risk? When you're young, your net worth is so small, you get into anything, the majority of your net worth is at risk. When you get older, you're like, okay, put 5%. And you're like, okay, that's not much for me to deal with emotionally. But when you're dealing with, $250,000 when you're just starting out in your career and you got a young family, that's a massive amount of money and a massive mental consequence to bear.
At this point in your life, right? How does your strategy look toward like retirement, and how do you approach retirement from a financial point of view, from a family planning point of view? How's that going to look?
Well, for me personally, I'm in a space where I could retire, I guess. I just don't really, I think as I look at it, I don't find retirement very appealing. I'm an engineer. I like to build stuff. I like to create. I want to be a contributor in society. And so it's much more around, when you have the resources, how do you invest them? There is a diversification. I mean, who knows? The whole market's so screwed up right now with all these factors that are going on. The BRIC nations doing what they're doing with the reserve currency. There's so many factors. And it was interesting. I was talking to a guy about all this stuff years ago, and he was like, yeah, when everything goes to heck, if everything ever goes to crap, it's going to go to crap in every industry. Like, is real estate all of a sudden going to be super secure if all of a sudden the whole market drops by 50%? No, there's going to be so much chaos in so many different areas. It's just going to be a bloodbath everywhere. And so I think there's a point of, for me, it's been, I can always try to minimize risk. And as an engineer, we do that, right? If you're building an airplane, you don't want it to fall out of the sky. But there's a point, like you say, in life, there's an ambiguity that you can't control everything. We're not engineering our whole political system and how everyone reacts. So it's just be optimistic and go forward and go like, I can only do what I can do. I'm going to secure as much as I can. I have real estate. Then I've got my other assets. I've tried to diversify. Then I have a business. So there's a point where I'm like, if everything goes bad, everything goes bad. None of these hedges is going to work. I mean, commercial real estate, everyone thought was phenomenal. And then COVID, and now they're like, all right, leases are coming up. How's this going to look? So there is a diversity piece in there. But I think, to me, retirement, I don't understand the whole idea of retirement. Like, what do I want to do? I've literally traveled a lot of the world already. I don't really want to go golf for the next 20, 30 years. It's like, so I look at it more from the standpoint of, what do I want to do now that I have the resources? I mean, I look at it more like Elon Musk, right? He made $22 million when he sold one of his companies, and he wasn't like, well, I'm going to sit on my laurels. He's like, Now I'm going to go build Tesla and SpaceX. So that's much more the model that I want for myself and for my family than, well, I made my money. I'm going to go, relax, sit by the pool and do nothing.
Yeah, it's one of the more impressive stories about Elon Musk in his earlier days. Just as you said, when he sold PayPal, he made a very large amount of money. I forget the exact number of millions, but he put all of that at risk with Tesla. Like if Tesla would have gone under, he would have lost pretty much 99% of whatever money he made on PayPal. So he really did put all of that at risk. That was kind of that's how much he believed in the whole electric car revolution, et cetera, which is, it's a big bet.
Oh, well, yeah. And you hear him talk about it, the emotion you see from him, when he was SpaceX and Tesla were at risk. And he's like, I knew I could save one of them, but I had to try to save both. So yeah, you see these amazing efforts. And that to me is where I look at it. What am I trying to accomplish? What's my long-term strategy? Was my long-term strategy finish life early and then check out? That's what you find so interesting is once you have those resources, now you can make a bigger impact. Now you have what I would call a good business model, right? And then you look at it broadly, you're like, so what do you want? You give someone $100 million, you give a lot of people who win these lotteries money. I have a story in my book where a guy got given $20 million. It was 6 years later, the guy's worse off. I think his wife had died and then he's totally drugged out and screwed up.
Yeah.
And you look at this going, that's where I talk about kind of the generational stuff. If you don't have a business model that knows how to use the resources, then you're just going to waste them. Right. And that's where you look at business, like you can look at Yahoo back in the day, Google was $1 million company, I think in 99, and Yahoo was a $92 billion company. And yet Google's business model was so good that it took the capital it had, kept hiring smart people, kept making more money, did that. This is the flywheel effect that Google went through. All the while, Yahoo's business model just ate all its capital. And it had smart engineers, it had smart people, it had all these great things, and yet Google still won. What did it sell for? Sold for a few $1 billion, I think, to Comcast. And now you look at Yahoo did, and Google's now, I don't remember what it is, at 1 point something trillion, 2 trillion or something. And so you look at it like the business model is the most important part of a company. It's not the resources. You know what I mean? Like if I give you a McDonald's without all this operations and the procedures, I gave you the real estate, and then you're like, well, I don't know how to make it work. I don't know how to market. I don't know how to sell. I don't know how to hire people. Then that resource isn't going to be that valuable. And that's the same thing you're looking at in your family. Like if you have a good business model that can produce wealth, then you want to exploit that until it doesn't work anymore, in my opinion. And when I talk about wealth, it's not just financial wealth. Are you building strong relationships and a reputation in your community? Are you also, investing in your health? Are you investing in your skills? Are you using your time efficiently? It's those type of things when you go broader, like it's not just money, it's how are you investing those to get those other resources.
And Aaron, what advice would you have for individuals who are maybe raising their children are still young? What kind of lessons can you instill in the kids? How do you raise the kids to make sure that their business model is similar to yours or their business model is set up for success?
Yeah, I mean, the tricky thing with I think especially for me as a husband, when I was doing a lot of work when I was outside the home. So my kids aren't seeing what I'm doing. And even when I worked from home for a while, my kids are seeing me on the computer. They're like, is he playing a video game or is he working? So it's much different than if I were a farmer working with my dad. So a lot of it's like, what are the values? This is the piece of the business model. What is your culture? Like Google is notorious for its culture, not notorious, infamous for its culture, right? Has a great culture that gives people a lot of freedom, a lot of responsibility. If you do your best work at a particular weird hour of the day, go do it. Because that's the culture. They're not trying to optimize, like you don't have to come in at exactly this time and leave at exactly this time. And if you're late by 5 minutes, you're fired. They don't care about that. They're more like, how do we get productivity out of it? So if that's the culture of you that you've been successful with, then how do you teach that? You're like, do I care if my kids are exactly home? Am I focused on this control? Well, if you do a weird control, then you're more like you're teaching your kids a Walmart culture, yet your culture that's been successful is a Google culture or a tech culture. And so it's a lot about being very intentional about what are the things that have made you successful. I mean, based on, we talked about your background. My background as well, mechanical engineer, MBA. I've done coding. I've built apps. I've coded in so many different languages, done analytics in so many, like this is a thing where you're perpetually learning. So if you're not passing on the love of learning to your kids and teaching them the fun of it, then when the time they get to they may go to college and do fine. And then after college, like, screw this, I've learned everything. I don't even like this. So it's, what is the culture of learning and what are your cultural values that you're passing on? And if you're not intentional about those, then what you often find happen is, well, maybe one kid got 4 out of the core 5 and the other kid got 3 out of the 5. And then you're like, well, you're really screwed up. So that's where it's, like Google has a set of values and they try to, at least from what I've seen on their website, those type of things, I don't recall them right now, but it's those values. If you're specific on your family values as well, then your kids will be able to actually implement those.
Yeah. And kids also pick up on things that you don't intend for them to. Like, kids will just pick up your behavior and your bad habits, right? So if you tell your kids, oh, be mindful of your money, spend it wisely, but then they see you just kind of go on vacation and blow all kinds of money on things, they notice that, right? They also notice the way that spouses talk to one another, whether or not they're patient, whether or not they're insulting. And you see that things like divorce rates, for example, kids who grew up in single parent homes are more likely to be divorced when they grow older. Like you see the kids kind of mimic and follow the good and the bad habits of their parents. So you're right. You have to be very mindful and very self-aware on exactly how you behave in front of the kids.
Well, yeah. And you have to, when I went on vacation with my children, I was like, here's what we went down to Mexico, but I was like, I wanted to optimize for them having a cultural experience. So we went down to the Cancun area. We hired a guy from Airbnb who took us into the Yucatan. We went to a real Mexican market. My kids didn't speak Mexican or Spanish, and they had to buy stuff at this market. And then we went and, made food with this family that lived in a concrete house and bamboo, or whatever that is, for their kitchen. And it was like, and then we did some other surfing, scuba diving. There was a lot of the things, but it wasn't, hey, we're going to come and relax. It was, we're going to come and learn a different culture. Because that's the stuff that I think is effective. If you go to, when I lived in Russia for 2 years, it's a very different culture. The way that men and women interact, the way that masculinity is, the way that femininity is, very different. I've also gone to China. I've been in Austria. So you go to all these different places, you understand the cultural differences, and then you can come back and look at your own family and be more intentional. It's, for a lot of kids, I see so many, it's really funny when you see a lot of really wealthy children who go to really elite schools and they talk and they think they're poor. And you're like, no, you guys are going to be the next 1%ers or 0.5%ers. And your parents are that. Like, you have no idea, but you haven't gone and actually experienced these other cultures to understand where you actually fit. And so you're making this assumption that, oh, I'm poor because I don't have a lot of money. No, go over to these other places, see what real poverty looks like. Then you can appreciate some of the structures that the United States has a lot more. So I think it's a lot of, how do you give your kids the experiences that you had that made you who you are?
Earlier, you mentioned that example about the gentleman who won a whole bunch of money on the lottery and then squandered it. And sadly, that story is very common. It's a lot more common than it should be. And maybe the corollary to that, like with the family, is that sometimes individuals get an inheritance and then they end up squandering that inheritance. And I think you touch upon this in your book as well. But Aaron, maybe give us some tips on how does the whole business model framework, how does that approach the inheritance and the family planning, like let's say generational wealth planning?
Well, this is where you go back to, I think most people are like, I want to pass on my wealth to my children, right? You've already started from a wrong mindset in terms of the wealth is in the business model. That's the wealth generator. Right. And so if you don't pass on the wealth generator, then all you are is passing on the output of the wealth generator without any instructions on how to use it. Right. Again, go back to if I gave you a McDonald's and I gave you there's an example in my book actually where a woman, she was given $20 million from her dad. Her dad died and they had a great insurance program or insurance policy. And, she's on her 4th marriage. She's bought and sold companies and had to borrow more money from her mom because she has no idea what to do with it. And this is where you come down to, what is your culture? How do you think about money? And if your kids don't think about money the same way you do, then you may be, oh, I'm going to give this to my kids. And then they spend it on drugs and kill themselves. And you're like, all my work was devoted to killing my child. That seems super contradictory. So a lot of it is, if you're not spending, and this is what I call investing, if you're not investing in your relationship with your children and teaching the cultural values, then there's no way that your kids are going to be good inheritors of the wealth, right? And if they're sitting there like, well, I don't want to get married, I just want to live off this. And you're like, well, I remember when I was young, I had nothing, but I'm going to give my kids everything. And so a lot of it is if you're very specific on your culture, you're helping them go through their structure. And then you're looking at their strategies they're talking about. Well, I want to be an artist. Okay, how's that going to work? Right. And then then I think the wealth you actually want to start to pass on is, okay, what skills can you pass to your children? Are they taking care of their physical health, their mental health? Are they investing their time? Because everyone has the human resource of time. Are they investing their time correctly? Are they reading? And then once you find out, yeah, they're investing their time, they're investing in new abilities, they're keeping their health in good shape, then you want to pass on the next resource, which is your relationships, right? Okay, let's go. Here's my accountant, here's my lawyer, here's my the people that have helped me succeed. Your real estate advisors, banks, all those relationships are massively important. And if you pass on those, and then you're teaching the kids how to manage those relationships. Yeah, you don't cheat them. Even if you could, you don't. If you screw them over, they're going to screw you over, or they'll just leave. And so you have to teach them that piece. And then the last piece, in my opinion, is the financial resources. And that's around, do you know how to invest in tools, right? Are you buying a computer because you want to play video games? Or are you buying a computer because you want to, be a programmer and it's going to help you be more efficient? Or, it's then you can give them some of the assets and you can give them the money. But if you don't go through this, check their business model first, then check their human resources, then check their social resources, then by the time you give them their financial, you're like, of course they're going to screw it up. Of course, you never taught them. It's your fault.
Absolutely. And it is complicated, right? Because on the one hand, when we were talking about how you're trying to optimize many different things, and those goals are competing against each other, right? On the one hand, and you see this all the time with successful business people, right? Is they work all the time, they're really focused on their business and their career, and they become very successful financially, let's say. But because they focus so much on their business, they didn't spend enough time with their kids, they didn't build those relationships, they didn't make those connections. And so the kids never learned how to run the business, how to run the family business, or how to, like you said, invest the money properly, or how to manage the money, or how to reach out to and build out that personal network for themselves. And on top of that, the kids might even resent the parents for not spending enough time with them or neglecting them. So it's quite sadly very common that kids will inherit a business and the business just tanks, right? Or there's that, I think it's a well-documented phenomenon of like the third generation business failure or third generation farm failure, where by the time it gets down to a third generation, very little of the work ethic or the financial management or any one of those core key skills that the founders had is gone.
Yeah, and this is because the intentionality wasn't there, right? I mean, the first generation, frankly, you kind of watch your parents and they're working their butts off, they're doing all this stuff. So you go, oh, hard work. You kind of, you see it a lot of times and you just see them constantly doing it. But then by the third generation, it's like, well, it's not there. So unless you're intentional, then it's going to dissolve. There are some case studies. There's a research article I read where there's some families, they gained a lot of wealth, and now they're 9 generations of still having a family identity. They're, 300 plus people that are all maintaining it, because you start to look at it going, hey, how are we going to use the money? Right? I mean, that's another weird thing. You have one kid who's a druggie and you have one kid who's, has a great business model and doing great in life. And then you're like, okay, I pass on, let's get 50-50. You're like, this doesn't make sense, because what you're going to do is the one kid will use it well. The other kid will just destroy the wealth, probably abuse the power, probably abuse people with that power because he doesn't know how to use it. So that's a lot of where you think about it. Like, the most important thing to pass on is the business model and then these other resources. But giving people money, and that's part of my problem with a lot of the policies where people are like, if we just give them money, we'll get rid of poverty. Poverty is a function of having a bad business model, right? If I have a restaurant that no one wants to eat at, so I'm losing money, and then the government comes in and says, let's give them $10,000 a month just because no one wants to eat there and we feel sad for them. All I'm going to do is try to open more restaurants, right? Great, now I'll get $20,000 and I'm not actually adding value to society. So it's much more important to if you find a bad business that's not working, you're like, let's fix the business, then it'll start generating money and then we'll solve these other problems. But I think it's just giving people resources, especially financial resources, usually ends up just hurting them, and they get rid of they lose those resources almost immediately.
And poverty is relative, right? Like if you ask somebody whether or not they feel poor, they're not going to just look at their life objectively. They're going to compare themselves to other human beings.
Yeah, and it comes down to the business model. That's one of the things that I think is difficult when you have bad business models, but you have support. You want to support your children. If you have a kid who's not productive, you're trying to support him, but then the act of supporting actually makes them, they're like, oh, look, I did nothing. Mom and dad gave me money. Okay, I'm going to, in a normal business model, you go, keep doing what you were doing that got you money. You're just being trained in essence. And then you go, oh, now I'm just going to keep doing this. But the problem is with a bad business model, especially where you're getting stuff for free, you can never do twice as much nothing. So you're like, well, I'm going to do twice as much, and then I'm going to get twice. Nope, you're just going to be not doing nothing and getting this paycheck. So I think it's a lot around how do you get a good business model where you're being a productive, where you're being a contributor, and using your financial wealth. I mean, that's the other thing to your point with Jeff Bezos. People will be like, he's so rich. And you're like, yeah, but not in the way that a lot of people think. Like, he's not sitting there with billions of dollars in his bank account. He's usually sitting there with all this stock, and he's got all that at risk. If it goes up, he gains money. If it goes down, he loses money. And then you see people, they're like, well, I don't have any assets. Well, you have nothing at risk. Therefore, nothing can go up or down. And then you complain about it. So it's, if you're only judging by your bank account, if you're rich or not, you're in a bad spot. You need to be looking at buying assets.
Yeah. And getting back to the whole business model thing, it was really disheartening to see during the pandemic, for example, that right as the stimulus checks went out, purchases of luxury goods like Gucci bags and stuff like that peaked as well. And I'm thinking, like, individuals are sitting at home, they're not working, they get a check in the mail, and they go and they just splurge and buy something silly that they really don't need. And then, of course, fast forward a few months and they feel poor again. And of course, it's not their fault. It's the world's. The world is conspiring against them, as it were.
Well, yeah, and that's where I think it's really our responsibility to teach good business models and to teach. I mean, you're seeing some of the problems in like San Francisco. There's the robbery rings, and you're seeing all these stores close because they're like, we can't make money, and we're not just going to keep throwing money at a location because we feel some obligation to it. And that's where I think it's, do you understand the social consequences of your behavior, right? Like, if one person lies in your society, it doesn't cause that many problems. But if everyone's lying, or if you have theft at a high level, and this is the thing, when I went to Russia, if I wanted to buy food, I would walk into the little store, everything's behind a counter with an assistant. I had to go add up all these numbers separately, go to the cash register, tell the woman how much I wanted, how many rubles I wanted to give her. She would then give me a receipt. Then I would have to go to the lady, and she would go, and then I'd say, I want 5 of those, 3 of those. She would have to add it all up, and then she would give it to me because they didn't trust each other at all, right? There was no trust. And another thing, I went and bought a beater, like a little mixer, for cakes and stuff. I'm like, okay, I want that one. The guy pulls it off the shelf, opens it up, plugs it in, pushes everything in, turns it on and off, shows me that it worked. Why? Because no one trusts anyone, right? They were like, I'm like, for me as an American, I'm like, what the crap? Why are you opening that? That's part of my experience. That's the Apple. Hey, let's open. And then over there, I'm like, you're opening it. Of course it's going to work. It's brand new. And if it doesn't, I'll just bring it back. And I was just like, no, I don't think that's a thing now. Like, there's no trust in the system because it's eroded away. And that's, I think, a lot of times when you see this lack of following rules, then all of a sudden everyone erodes trust. then everyone has to cover their own butt. And then you have all these extra systems. I just saw today, Target put almost all of their stuff behind plexiglass because they were having problems with theft. And so you're like, well, what is that? Now it increases the cost. Now they have to have more employees. Now it's going to slow down everything. You're paying with time, you're paying with money, but it's because of this erosion of trust. So I think that's part of those pieces in your business model. If you're cheating people, you can get away with it for a little bit. But over time, people will start to be like, don't do business with that person. You'll develop the bad reputation, and it will potentially screw your kids over, right? If your kids go and work for someone else and they're sucky workers, they'll be like, cool, don't hire him. I mean, I've definitely seen that in the people that I've interacted with. I'm like, yeah, we had just that family, not trustworthy, not going to do anything with them.
Very well said, Aaron. Aaron, as we move to wrap up this interview, where can people learn more about the book and where can people reach you?
Yeah, they can go to the book is on Amazon. I have a website called thefamilyflywheel.com. It's got some resources that you can go. It'll help you build out your business model. It'll help you look at your resources. I mean, my goal is to make families more successful. So that's one of those things. If you'd like to contact me directly, you can contact me at aaron@thefamilyflywheel.com, or you can go to LinkedIn or Facebook, Aaron K. Shelley.
Aaron, what is the free guide that people can get on your website?
The guides, there's a guide, and then there's essentially a slideshow that helps you go along with it. And it's just saying, it's helping you figure out what is your strategy. And if you're married, do it with your spouse, but do hers. What is her strategy? What's your strategy? What's your culture? What's her culture? What's your structure? And then what are the resources you see? What are the resources she sees? And then compare those. Because when you're comparing and you're like, oh, here's what I think our values are. And she's like, I don't think that. Or here's what I think our strategy is. Oh, I don't believe that. That's where you're like trying to get alignment, right? And because if you've ever been in a smaller company as they're going through the values, it's never this trivial, like, oh, I think we got these 5. And what's our mission? Oh, it's super simple. You're like, it takes a lot of thinking through. And so it's really trying to help couples and individuals think through their own family business model and what they're trying to achieve.
Aaron, I really enjoyed this conversation. The book is called The Family Flywheel, and it's all about how to manage and run your family like a business. Aaron, thanks very much for all your work. Keep up the good work, and thanks very much. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot, Gabe. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps me out. Thanks very much.